So, by the way, did we forget that there was a war going on in the world or some part of the world? At least if you've been watching Cut the Clutter for the past few weeks, you might get that impression. And also, if you see your front pages, if you see your TV channels, all the TV channels which had sent reporters to this place or that place who were saying, I'm now watching rockets coming in, shells going out, or whatever, and I'm seeing one hit the other, giving you aankhon dekha hal, all that's now missing. So it looks like the whole Ukraine war has gone out of our lives. But that's not a reality. A very vicious war is going on. In fact, if anything, the war has become more vicious than before. Also, importantly, the war has changed its trend a little bit, or more than a little bit, although the change is slow. Change is slow, but because the change is over a large front, it is quite important. I will not say dramatic, but it's quite important. So what happened in the first round of the war? The first round of the war, Putin's forces, we say Putin's forces because he's now delivered a speech where he's pretty much painted himself as Peter the Great, as the great Tsar who had conquered, who had built imperial Russia. So he's actually leapfrogging backward from Lenin's times. He's not building the Soviet Union, he's building imperialist Russia, in which definition the existence of Ukraine as a separate sovereign nation is an obscenity. It is unacceptable for him. So he's painting himself like that. So that's why we'll call his armies Putin's armies. So initially when his armies came in, it looked like Ukrainians were not fighting and his armies got very close to Kyiv. In fact, they were in the outskirts of Kyiv, and all of us saw those dramatic pictures of 67-kilometer long convoys of armored vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, also missile carriers, also multi-barrel rocket launchers, artillery guns, etc., etc., etc. So it looked like a giant equivalent of our Republic Day parade, or maybe more like the 1st of October parade in Moscow, that all of the heavy stuff of Russian army was now driving into Kyiv and they will take over. That didn't happen. Why that did not happen? And that's its story turned dramatically. It turned dramatically because Ukrainians turned their weakness, which was numbers, which was the paucity of this kind of heavy firepower or heavy equipment, into a strength. So they carried out a new version, a rocketized or a missilized version of guerrilla warfare against it. So if you have all these tanks lined up and you can get one of these Bayraktar drones coming in from somewhere, it takes out two of them, or in a convoy, if it takes out the front two or the last two, and then you have small bands of people, guerrillas or special forces here and there with those javelin or other kinds of missiles, and Law's javelin, and they would take out a couple of tanks in the middle. That will set off panic, and that's why they captured a lot of tanks and vehicles. They destroyed a lot of tanks and vehicles. There was panic in the Russian armed forces, and Russia was decisively defeated in its attempt to take Kyiv. So round one went to Ukraine, and that also caused a kind of headiness on Ukraine's side and also on the side of those backing Ukraine. The second round again looked like Ukraine had won, and probably they did, and that was the siege of Kharkiv. Kharkiv, if you see on the map, it is sort of in the northeast, right? It's in the northeast. It's also a large city, which is the closest to the border with Russia, not the border with Belarus, as other places are in the north, but with Russia, right? So Russian forces had laid siege to it. In the first few days, it looked like Kharkiv would fall any moment, but the Ukrainians counterattacked, they took it back, and they drove the Russians away from Kharkiv. So that, and Russians then withdrew, in this case, in a fairly orderly manner, not in a kind of chaotic, self-destructive mess as they did from Kyiv. So that looked like round two to Ukraine. Then the Russians consolidated, they learned from their mistakes, and you know, in warfare, as maybe in sport, the side that loses draws stronger lessons because they have more reasons to learn. They have more reasons to introspect. The side that wins thinks that if I am winning, why change? Why mend what ain't broken? So Russians learned, and Russians figured that they have to, first of all, they must deny the Ukrainians guerrilla warfare, because that's what makes a band of 2 or 3 soldiers slow down or stop a battalion tactical group. That is the basic unit in which the Russian army fights. So just 3 stopping maybe 1,200, 1,300 people, or 3 then stopping maybe a regiment with 40, 50 tanks in its tracks, because you take out the first, you take out the last. So they decided to deny them this guerrilla warfare. The second, they learned that they must work on their strength, and their strength is numbers. In terms of numbers of soldiers, as well as number of weapons, but more importantly, the amount of ammunition, the number of artillery shells they can fire in a day. They are enormously bigger than Ukraine, because Ukraine has a double problem. One, Ukraine didn't have that many to begin with, and second, all of Ukraine's artillery, as the war started, was of Russian or Soviet origin. So all of the ammunition also was Russian and Soviet origin. So they are now running out of that ammunition. So Russians then decided to fight a conventional war where a much larger army advances along a very long front, in this case 500 miles or nearly 800 kilometers, mainly in the Donbas area, to take that region and fight a grinding battle. That grinding battle is now going on, and that is where the Russians have begun to make progress for once now. Russians are gaining ground. They are gaining ground very slowly. So in fact, if I go to the website of Institute of Study of War, and you should also do that if you're interested in this war, I noticed that every day the Russians advance by no more than 500 meters, 1 kilometer, but over a long front. And it is now a consistent pattern that as the Russians advance, Ukrainians are being pushed back. Ukrainians are now very worried that they are losing control of a town called Severodonetsk. Now, Severodonetsk is the last sizable habitation. It's not a big city. It's a city of just about 1,02,000, 3,000 people. And most of the civilians have already fled the city. But the fact is, it is probably the biggest urban center in the Luhansk region. You know, Donbas is Luhansk and Donetsk. So it is the biggest urban center in the Luhansk region that the Ukrainians still controlled. In fact, in 2014, when the Russians took Crimea, Russian-backed insurgents, or what is called as LPR, Luhansk People's Republic, which the Russians recognized as a sovereign nation just before they started this war, they had, with the help of Russians, taken Severodonetsk away from the Ukrainians. Later, the Ukrainians won it back, I think in 2016. Now that's very critical, because this sits on the top of what is called as Sievierodonetsk River. So Severodonetsk, in case you are wondering where did the name come from, that's because the river on which it's located, that is Sievierodonetsk. And you might remember Sievierodonetsk was the river which a Russian regiment tried to cross some time back, which was trapped there by Ukrainian artillery and drones and others, and was completely annihilated, leading to the death of nearly 500 to 600 Russian soldiers. And you saw those wreckages of tanks, trucks and armored vehicles there. So it's the same river. Why is that river important? Look at the map again. That river is important because Ukraine is divided effectively in terms of strategic considerations, or let's say immediately tactical considerations, between an east and the southern region, that is the Donbas region, and then the north and the west region, which, for want of a better expression, we might call mainland Ukraine. I know Ukrainians would not like my saying that, because they see all of Ukraine as the mainland. But I'm just dividing this based on a river, because basically this east-west division in Ukraine is with the Nipro River or the Nipro River, right? Russians, whatever they have, is this side of Nipro River, that is eastern side of Nipro River. In fact, the only thing the Russians control on the west of the Nipro River is a town, or is the settlement of Kherson. That is in the south. You will again see it on the map, and we'll talk about that also, because a lot of fighting is going on there also. Now, the Russians, what they are trying to do now is try and take over all of the Donbas area. If they do that, then that becomes one trigger for Putin to declare victory and maybe ask for a ceasefire or ask for a settlement, saying, I have all the territory I wanted, and these are separate countries, or these are part of my country, they are a part of Russia. That is what Ukraine doesn't want. That's why it's so critical for Ukraine to keep its foothold at Severodonetsk, which is why the Russians want it. Now, if you've been following the progress of that battle, and I've been watching Institute for the Study of War for quite some time now, and also the the UK Ministry of Defence updates. So UK Ministry of Defence puts out their own defence intelligence updates almost every day. So I've looked at today's updates also. So today's update on the UK Ministry of Defence Twitter handle, that makes 3 points. Number one, they say that after a month of fighting for Severodonetsk, now it looks like the Russian forces are in control of most of the city, most of Severodonetsk. Number two, that elements of Ukrainian forces, remnants of Ukrainian forces, and a few hundred civilians and a bunch of civilians are now hiding. They are hiding in the Azot chemical plant. Azot means nitrogen, right? So this chemical plant produces nitrogenous fertilizers, mainly ammonium nitrate, and that it was hit by a bomb just the other day, and the nitric acid tank blew up, and that is what sent a lot of people indoors in Severodonetsk. So a lot of civilians and soldiers are hiding underneath this chemical plants. That's a bit like Azovstal. You remember the steel plant where a lot of fighters had taken refuge and later surrendered. Again, this UK intelligence update on the Ministry of Defence handle, it also says that these fellows who are inside the plant or in the basement are now fighting and engaging the Russian forces, which means because they are pinning down the Russian forces, they are not allowing the Russians to free these forces up to go and fight elsewhere. And finally, they say it is highly unlikely that the Russians, as expected, this kind of resistance in Sievierodonetsk, because they might have thought that, look, this is the other side of the river. Everybody, all Ukrainian defenders have their backs to the river. So at some point, there will be great temptations to cross the river and go back. They've got so desperate to capture Severodonetsk that they have blown up all the 3 bridges across the river, across the Seversky Donetsk river. Now, which might be a mixed blessing, because in one way it demoralizes the defenders because they know they can't get supplies, etc. anymore, although Ukraine is bravely saying that they are maintaining the supplies, but it does demoralize the defenders if you don't know where will your supplies come from, or where will you retreat, or how will you withdraw. But at the same time, this is also self-destructive for Russia, because how do the Russian armies then now cross the river and go to the other side? Because there is a much stronger Ukrainian redoubt on the other side called Lysychansk, and that is a little bit on the height. That is a more defensible target, and the Russians want to take that. Now for them to cross the river, they will have to do all contested river crossings, which means you try to throw some assault bridging across the river. It's not a very big river, but it's not drain number 8 of Delhi either, or Shadra drain either. It's a still sizable river. So if they decide to throw assault bridging across it so their forces can cross, that assault bridge becomes a target. So again, any river crossing will now be contested. But the fact is that Russians are now very close to taking Severodonetsk. In the recent past, Zelensky has said that the Battle of Severodonetsk will decide the fate of this war. Now that may have been also to up the morale and fighting spirit of his own troops, which by the way has not been lacking, which is a big surprise even for the Russians. They would have thought by now that Ukrainian defenders will give up, but that is not happening. At the same time, it is a small bit of territory, but this helps the Russians more or less get almost the entire Luhansk region into their bag. And once they get the rest of Donetsk, then possibly, I'm not saying he'll do it, because maybe he'll still want all of Ukraine to capitulate, but possibly then Putin could declare victory. That is something Ukrainians don't want, and Ukrainian supporters, that is the Western powers, they don't want this either. Now we have quotes in the international media from Serhiy Haidai, who is Luhansk governor, who has been saying that, look, we are fighting, but now it looks like more than 90% of this town, that is Severodonetsk, is under Russian control. That's what he said on June 9. Now, before that also, Russians had taken that much of the town. But June 5, the Ukrainians launched a counterattack and pushed the Russians back from about a half of it. But the Ukrainians fought a tactical battle. They pushed the Russians back, and once the Russians brought heavy artillery and started bombing the city, then the Ukrainians withdrew. So they played a little bit of a guerrilla warfare on a larger scale. So they pushed the Russians back, they tempted into firing a lot of their artillery, and they pulled back. But the fact right now is that Russia is on the verge of taking Severodonetsk, and they will now be sharpening the knives for Lysychansk. Once again, you can see it's the other side of the river. And if the Russians come the other side of the river and establish a foothold, that will become a much bigger threat to mainland Ukraine. Once again, if you see northeast of this, the city of Kharkiv. Kharkiv is a big city, one of the biggest in Ukraine. Now that is where Ukrainian forces pushed Russians back to quite some distance, to such a distance that they could no longer target the city with their long-range artillery. Now you might say that long-range artillery has a range of 50-60 kilometers, so how far back did you push them? Did the Ukrainians push them? But you must remember that the side that fires at the other one long-range artillery, it can't be standing on the border, can't be positioning its artillery on the border and firing from there. It has to be also out of your firing range from wherever you can bring in your artillery. So your heavy units, heavy artillery also has to be far in the back in your own defended territory. Now it looks like Kharkiv is getting some fire from Russian artillery, and once again that's an area where all sources show us, all sources which report with evidence and pictures, etc., that Russians are launching fresh counterattacks north of Kharkiv, maybe if only to force the Ukrainians to divert some of their forces from the defense of Severodonetsk towards Kharkiv. So that is the other thing that's happening. Then you come further south. As you come further south, you see the settlement of Kherson. Now, Kherson is a sizable settlement. It's the only foothold the Russians have this side of the Nipro River, that is west of the Nipro River. Now, when a ceasefire comes, if the Russians are still in control of Kherson, that means they'll consolidate, they'll do their bridging, they'll put more forces there, and that will become a launching pad for a much bigger offensive on Kyiv and other parts of the central, western and northern zones of Kyiv. So Ukrainians don't want the Russians to retain this. That's why you will find the only area where Ukrainians are launching counterattacks, and they've been partly successful, is in the Kherson area. So again and again, every day you will find one or two villages, you find the Ukrainians taking them, but they haven't yet driven the Russians back from Kherson. They are about 5 kilometers from Kherson. About 2 weeks back, they were 18 kilometers. So once again, they are making progress. But like the progress by the Russians, this progress also is very gradual, very grounding, and both sides are suffering losses. Now, Russians are suffering losses, but what happens in a battle of attrition? In a large-scale battle of attrition like this, the bigger side, the more numerous side, will invariably win. Because this is like what used to be said of the Chinese human wave tactics in the 50s and 60s. Now, if you have 100 very brave and very well armed people defending a hill feature, and they are attacked by waves of several thousand each time, and a lot of them die or get wounded, but more keep coming in. At some point, the 100 defenders will get overwhelmed. That's precisely what happened to that company of Kumaon regiment of Indian Army in the Battle of Chushul, or the famous storied Battle of Rizangla. Ultimately, numbers overwhelm you. That's what's happening right now between Russian forces and Ukrainians. So Ukrainians, senior Ukrainian people, including a Ukrainian general, they have said that their artillery is now outnumbered 10:1 by the Russians, which is very likely. Now, not only is their artillery outnumbered 10 is to 1 by way of number of artillery pieces that are firing, but also in terms of availability of ammunition. So Russians can fire a lot more ammunition. How much they are firing? Look at these pictures, these satellite pictures. These are Maxar satellite pictures that have emerged of Ukrainian countryside, and see how many holes do you see in the ground. Now this is satellite picture, so it's not as if this, you can jump from one hole to the other. There is some distance between them, but in a satellite picture you can see how concentrated this bombardment is. So it's like the carpet bombing from the artillery multiplied to maybe a scale of several times over what might be done from the air. And Russians are doing it because they have unlimited ammunition and they have a lot of guns. And when you have massed artillery firing like this, it does break the will of the defender, because there is no place to hide from long range artillery. And that's why Ukrainian demands. So there is a story in the New York Times which I am sharing with you. I'll share a link with you that tells you that Ukrainians are now making demands which are almost impossible to meet. For example, they are now saying we need 1,000 more artillery guns, 1,000 more howitzers. Now, how many are available? The Americans so far have given just over 100, and some European countries have given a dozen, 2 dozens each. So 1,000 are not going to be coming. They have asked for 300 multi-barrel rocket launcher systems, MRLS. Now there is no way 300 will be available from anywhere. I think the Americans have given about 4 or 5 or 6, and the rest may give some more. Similarly, they've asked for 2,000 infantry fighting vehicles. Nobody has got that kind of inventory of infantry fighting vehicles. Nobody can give you those. They've also asked for 1,000 drones. Again, nobody keeps reserves of drones, tanks. They've asked for 500 tanks also. Artillery pieces like this. Any country, even a rich country, might have 20%, 30% reserves, but nobody has reserves on this scale. So it shows us that Ukrainians are now hurting. So where does a war of attrition like this take us? A war of attrition is about the staying power. It's also about the ability to take damage. Ukrainian government has now said that they are losing about 200 soldiers a day. So if 200 soldiers die in a day, right? One, it's a lot of people to die per day for any army in the world. Any army in the world. Remember, for perspective, in nearly 4 months of fighting in Kargil, we lost 520 or thereabouts lives. And it hurt a country of our size so badly. We are still angry about it. In this case, a small country like Ukraine, 4 crore population, suffering 200 dead. But this has another dimension. In modern warfare, particularly when most of the damage is being done by artillery. In fact, today, what you have in Ukraine is an artillery war. In that situation, because a lot of shrapnel is flying, for each soldier that dies, you have to calculate that 4 more, at least 4 more are wounded and taken out of action. So 200 soldiers died per day means 1,000 soldiers taken out of action every day. Now, most likely worse is happening on the Russian side, but they have access to a lot more. So again, in terms of sheer ability to take attrition, Russians can overwhelm the Ukrainians in the course of time. But it's also evident the Ukrainians are fighting. So it's not as if the Russians at some point will have a cakewalk. Although I am sure in Putin's high command, somebody is imagining that at some point, Ukrainians will say, okay, it's not worthwhile fighting anymore. So once again, I gave you this update because it's been a long time since we talked about what was going on. And it's a serious war because you know what's happened. It has thrown the whole world upside down. We've seen what's happened with fuel prices all over the world. We see inflation rising. Now a big crisis is developing on food grain. Ukraine at this point has 22 million tons of grain, most of it wheat, from the last crop. It is sitting there. It cannot be taken out by ships because Black Sea is blockaded by the Russian Navy. Ukrainians don't have the ability, and Europe doesn't have the ability to evacuate it by train. In any case, there is a complication there because the gauge that the Ukrainians use for railway is different from the gauge that the Europeans use. So now Americans are making arrangements to evacuate as much of the grain as possible out of Ukraine and then set up godowns in Poland and store it there and then ship it forward. But the fact is that countries like Egypt, Turkey, Senegal, Pakistan, Afghanistan, who desperately need this wheat, they could be facing a big crisis in weeks to come and months to come, because what will happen in Ukraine is that soon enough their winter wheat crop will be ready for harvesting. When that happens, they will not be able to store that crop also, that harvest also. So they are saying that in that case, we'll just burn this 22 million tons of food grain. So there's a food grain crisis also. It's a serious war. It's a war that concerns us all. So please pay attention to this. And if you want to follow Institute of the Study of War, I find it very interesting and very authentic. This is run by an organization called understandingwar.org. Was founded by a bright young woman, young in the sense that she's still only 50, which is very young by think tank standards. So her name is Dr. Kimberly Kagan. She set up this think tank in 2007 at a time when the Americans were caught in that brutal counterinsurgency operation in Iraq. And as I conclude this, let me also tell you, alert you that next several days I'm going to be just taking a little bit of a break, maybe traveling a little bit. So I might be missing in action more often that you've known me to be, but in which case, please give me some space and time. Maybe a week or 10 days later, I'll be back with you like clockwork once again.